Buenas tardes a
Good
todas.
evening, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. On behalf of the Fundación Mafre, we welcome you to this new space we inaugurate today, and welcome KBR. Welcome Thyago. Thanks for being here from Sao Paulo, Brazil today. I would like to say very briefly that in the line of lectures that we've had since we inaugurated the KBR. The program we begin today will offer throughout the year conferences, lectures, dialogues on the samples and exhibitions we present to help us to delve into the different programs, the work of the photographers, their work. And it's a tremendous opportunity to be here with the protagonists and look at what they're offering and their themes. We're very pleased to be able to offer you this thanks to the generosity of the speakers. And we present 4 sessions, which will be about exhibitions of Claudia Andujar, La Mirada Cautiva, Larry Winningham, and then Dixon. They'll be online, these sessions, and we hope to be able to do them physically soon. Thyago Nogueira is a curator, director of the Department of Contemporary Photography at the Moreira Salles Institute in Brazil and works at Zoom, managing director or editor. And this presentation comes out of 4 years of research into Claudia Andujar and her work. We'll look through the exhibition, the photographs of Claudia, the ones that she took in the 70s, 60s, 70s in Brazil, and then we'll go through 5 decades of her career associated with the Amazon community of the Yanomami, a career where she went from art to activism, politics, and she set up a whole. Her work became a whole, photography and politics. And we invite you to use the chat to leave messages and questions and comments so that we can transmit them to Thyago Nogueira after his presentation. I pass the floor to you, Thyago, and I thank you very much for being here today. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, María. ¿Me escuchas?
Sí, perfectamente.
Thank you very much, Maria. Can you hear me? Good, thank you to everyone.
We thought this was going to be easier for everyone to hear. First, I would like to thank a lot the people from MAPFRE for hosting this exhibition. It's been a very long project and a very intense research for all of us, with a lot of dedication for so many people, not only from Claudia's, but also from the Anomaly and from many other institutions and organizations that have worked around this research and exhibition, especially Instituto Moreira Salles, where I work, and Hutucara Associação Yanomami, which is the Yanomami Association that is directed by Davi Copenaua, and also Instituto Socioambiental in Brazil, that for many years has been working around indigenous issues in the country and doing a very, very important job in terms of defending their rights, their lands, and making people aware of their plight. So yes.
Disculpa un segundo. Solamente quería decir, disculparme que no...
Just a second. I just wanted to say, I didn't say before, I apologize. At the bottom of your screen, you can choose to listen to the interpreting. So that's for the audience. So Thyago, when you're ready, you can continue.
Okay. Do I need to do anything with the controls? No, I'm okay, right?
Sí.
Okay.
No, you don't. Just carry on, Thyago. Thank you very much.
So what I thought of presenting today was a little bit of that trajectory that I've learned with Claudia, especially because the exhibition in Spain is dedicated to her work and to the understanding of her production and the evolution and changing and development of her production in terms of photography, but not only in photography, in art in general, and then into activism. And I thought I could present a little bit her trajectory to really show how her personal story and her professional story intertwined into a very complex story of indigenous protection, and also into showing us how art can work in favor of ethical commitments and the defense of minorities, not only of the Yanomami, but also of many other people that need our attention and they need protection and they need to be heard. So, just to start, I have prepared a little presentation. Let's see if I get this right. Yeah, I hope you can see my screen. So, I mean, the project of is really studying, I work in an institution, the Instituto Moreira Salles in Brazil, that takes care of archives of many photographers. So I think my main interest from, to enter Claudia's work was really to understand the complexity of her career and the different moments of her trajectory, and to understand how cleverly she managed to use her art and images in many different ways throughout those years. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Claudia's stories, but I think it's important to, make a little biographical note on her trajectory, because that trajectory will influence, I feel, a lot what she has been doing today. Claudia was born in Switzerland, actually, but she was raised in Transylvania in 1931 from two different families, of a Jewish Hungarian family and a Swiss Protestant family. And their parents divorced when she was very old, very young. And she was raised within this, unstable family. And at times she was kept with her father and at times with her mother. But the thing is, she was raised during when the Second World War broke in Europe. And that was very tragic, because all her father's family that had Jewish origins were taken away, first to a ghetto in the city, which then left Claudia to live alone in a boarding school. And then when really the occupation of Transylvania started, Claudia the boarding school closed. Claudia was sent to her mother's house, and she remembers very vividly how the day that her father came to say goodbye to her, because he was being taken, and he was actually taken to concentration camps. He and his whole family were taken to concentration camps and were later exterminated. And Claudia had to run away from first from Transylvania to Switzerland in a very, very difficult journey. She was, they were stopped in Vienna. They were interrogated by Gestapo many times. Her mother fell ill in the middle of the journey, and she finally arrived in Switzerland, where she lived for a while. But then she also found a relative that was living in the US, and she immigrated to the US, where she started her studies as in humanities at the Hunter College in New York. So there is an interesting also connection in that story, because Claudia is, studying at the Hunter College. She's working as an interpreter, as this is around end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s. She's working as she finds a job as an interpreter at the United Nations. And she marries a Spanish Civil War refugee, this man on the left, Julio Andujar, that had emigrated to Cuba and then illegally to the US, and they get married. And he was, trying to find a place for him in the US. He decides to look for a green card. And then for that, he decides to join the army and fight on the Korean War. So they are newly married, but Julio moves away and goes to Korea to fight on the war. And when they come back, they are already, they decide to divorce. And Claudia decides to keep this Andujar, which is very peculiar, because they have a very brief relationship. But of course, she decides to keep his last name to hide her Jewish origins and to really start a new life. And you can see here also Claudia's, when she was living in the United States, she starts also to do some paintings. This is her first let's say, exhibition in the United Nations, where she's showing one of her abstract paintings. She's not a photographer at that time. She's just working as an artist and mostly as a painter. And in 1955, she hears that her mother is living in Brazil, and she decides to reunite with her, and she comes to Brazil to visit her. And then this is, you see on the top right, you know, her visa to enter Brazil. And then Claudia really arrives in Brazil, and through her words, she say, you know, I felt very immediately welcomed here. I felt, you know, very well received, and I decided to stay here for a long time. So she really moves to Brazil in 1955, and this is when she picks up her camera for the first time and starts to travel around not only the country but also Latin America. First, I think, you know, to shoot images as a tourist. I think as most of us work with our cameras. And then, you know, she starts to do very planned travels in Peru, in Bolivia. And I think she starts to understand that as a kind of a more important language for her to communicate with people. So Claudia didn't speak Portuguese at that time. She was really, although she spoke many languages because of her origins, you know, Hungarian, German, French, English. She says that, you know, picking up a camera at the time was the way that she found to establish, to create a language for her and to communicate with people. And this is really how she starts to travel around Brazil and organize some, let's say, very early photo essays, and starts to move from a more touristic and more, you know, curiosity to a more socially engaged work, and starts to trying to publish this work on the magazines. So one of the first works that Claudia does at the time was called Brazilian Families. It's a very interesting series because she elects 4 different families in the country, very different families, and in very different geographical spaces of Brazil. And she decides to live with them to try to understand better the country's culture, but also the social and the regional difference of Brazil, which, as you know, is a very vast and big country. And I think Claudia is, so she chose this, for instance, this is an image of a family that she chose that was living in Bahia, which is the northeast part of the country. It was a farmer's family, very rich, powerful farmer's family that ran a coffee and cacao plantation. And she just, you know, knocks the door and asks to live with them for a certain period of time, and starts to photograph their routine. And of course, she's already interested, you know, in the social inequalities, in understanding really what constitutes Brazilians' society and Brazilians' relations. And she spends a while with this family and produces many images. The next family that she chose, as I said, she selects 4 families. The next one is a middle-class urban family that lived in São Paulo. It's a very, you know, the let's say the chief of the family was connected to the police, but it was a very middle-class, normal family in São Paulo, and they're preparing for the anniversary of the chief of the family. And she's also living with them and spending time and documenting that families. At first, with no outcome, I mean, no planned outcome. She was not doing this as a commissioned work. She was, you know, just photographing, and was later going to try to sell this work to a magazine or try to publish that on a magazine. And you see, of course, she's very, I think because of her, you know, connections in New York, she's also very influenced by the photography at the time. She had connections with Edward Steichen at MoMA. She had connections. She admired Eugene Smith, that was publishing at Life at the moment. And I feel that there is a whole idea of, you know, the documentarian production that she's trying to create that is very influenced by the American photographers that she starts to admire and study. This is the third family that she's photographing, which is a very poor family, that fisherman's family that lived in the coast of São Paulo state. She also travels by boat to visit them and stays for some days with them, photographing their routine. And of course, I feel that she's already, creating more complex images as a photographer, starting to really develop a language of her own. And this is the fourth family that she lives with. It's a very religious family that was living in Minas Gerais state, and they had an entire, small church inside of their property. But also, she was very, attentive to social class divides, and the social and racial division in Brazil. She's also photographing one very important anniversary into the family. But what I feel it's interesting about this work when I look at it is she's in a way developing this kind of, right on the beginning of her photographic work, she's developing this kind of anthropological immersion that I feel she will, give another scale to that when she's working with the Anomaly. But it's really using photography not only to communicate, to understand, but immersing herself into a reality and trying to narrate that reality through the images that she's producing, and of course observing that reality through her production. And even though that at that time it was really difficult for her to publish this work, because she was working in Brazil in a cultural scene that didn't really, that had not incorporated the women's production into photojournalism and into the magazines. She had a very, she was trying to show her work to some editors, and they were saying, well, we don't want women working on those themes. We are not interested also on, this very regular and common families. Brazil was this is the 60s, so Brazil was really interested in promoting a very idealized version of itself. Modern photography in Brazil was also very aware and very keen, to promote the developing country, the new paradigms for industrialization. And I feel that Claudia's interest for, different social stratus and for social divides and for a more humanistic approach was not something that really was easy to publish on Brazilian magazines. So the way that she found for, those pictures were first published through one of her contacts in the US in a Catholic magazine that was called Jubilee, and that especially because of this family in Minas Gerais that was very Catholic and that, had many images related to their religions, and they all worked around this religious context, she really found a space there. And this is interesting because it was, I feel that it was only because she had, strong connections with the US and she found her way to publish on that context that, doors started to open for her in Brazil. It was really a kind of a reverse process where she had to be affirmed outside of Brazil to really find places and see doors opening for her here. This is Claudia around the 70s, when she's really already, recognizing herself as a professional photographer, and is working in a lot of other thematic issues. And I think really, that things start to change for Claudia when she starts to work as a photojournalist. So she's producing images for herself, but then she really, starts to move towards the photojournalism work context. And things really change when she becomes one of the members of this very important magazine that we had in Brazil called Realidade, meaning reality, the title of the magazine. And it was a very, very important magazine here because it hired a very well-known team of reporters and photographers. They gave them completely freedom to address, the themes that they wanted to, It was very inspired by the new journalism writings, and also by the, American, of course, in the tradition of Life and Look magazines, but magazines that were presenting the new behaviors of society, the developments of the 60s, the changes in the behavior of the society, scientific changes also in the society, but also that were, challenging the way images were reproduced on the magazines. So they had, they printed magazines, they printed on photographs in color. They had very experimental graphic design for the magazines. But I think most of all, they really trust the power of images and photography to create an autonomous narrative and discourse. And I think this gave a lot of energy for Claudia, because she had this independence in choosing her themes, the things that she wanted to work around when she was working on the staff of the magazine. And she had, the film that she needed to do her job. She didn't even need to be working with a reporter on the features. They could work separately in different times, and even they could, have parallel discourses when publishing on the magazine. And this was certainly, an injection of freedom to her work, and also of enthusiasm and energy. And I feel that really changed the way Claudia was photographing, and also gave her the opportunity to, dive deeper into the subjects that really interested her. So one of the first features that she's publishing on the magazine is this story about a midwife that was working in this very small city, a city that had recently, been given a very modern hospital, but where the women prefer to give birth, still prefer to have their babies in their houses with this midwife. And she followed the work of this midwife all around the houses, following some of the births and the families, and trying to really tell the story of this woman into this community, and how they prefer to work in the traditional way. And it was a very strong, actually, feature, because she photographed the birth of children. We present that on the exhibition that's now at MAPFRE. I didn't bring it here, the image, because I thought, maybe later YouTube will cancel this talk. So but it's a very strong image of, a woman giving birth that actually made the magazine being apprehended by the censors during when it was when it was on the stands. It's important also to say that Brazil, this is 1966, 67. Brazil was just, starting a very long and dark period of the dictatorship that had started with the coup d'etat in 1964. And it was a very delicate moment, because from this moment on, things are going to be more and more controlled, more and more censored, until we embark in a very, very terrible moment of repression and of completely, let's say, muting the power of journalism, images, and artists to produce and to vocalize their own ideas. So Claudia is still working with a certain freedom. The magazine is still, let's say, working even under dictatorship with a certain freedom, proposing themes that are very challenging for the society. And they're publishing this. You can see a little bit of the, the way that they published. Of course, the photographers are credited at this point. This is another photo essay that she's, I talked about Eugene Smith, and then when you're thinking about the midwife essay, you can think of, that famous country doctor feature that he published on Life magazine. He also followed a nurse, very important nurse, doing her job. So I feel, Claudia was learning from that magazine, from that experience, and from that context of photography, and was really trying to find her own voice and her own ideas and her own themes. One of the important issues that she's publishing also is on Zé Arigó, which is a spiritual surgeon. He was a medium that was working in the middle of Brazil, and that was operating people. He became very, very famous and controversial also because of his operations. He had, of course, no medical graduation education, but he was really famous. People from all over the country and even from Latin America flocked to that region to be operated by him. And Claudia got very interested on the feature. She decided to go there and really follow, one of these operations, and produced a very strong and very actually cinematic narrative of that story, which I think is also a very important point to understand, Claudia's production, because, the whole idea of sequencing and of cinema, it's really important to her work. She really tries to keep the idea of a narrative and of a sequence very present in the way she thinks about her work. And she says that, I think she went to visit, I don't know if it was Steichen or Eugene Smith or some great photographer, where she showed her work, and he said to her, you shouldn't be a photographer, you should be a movie maker. And I think she really identifies with that idea of using photography in a very narrative way, and something that I feel also it's connected to the way photography was at the time created through the film, the strip of the 35 millimeters film, that really, when you look at the contact sheets of Claudia, you really understand how she's thinking always as a narrative that envelops in different frames, and not so much as a all-encompassing frame that tells the entire story of photography in just one single image. So Claudia, kept working for some years on Realidade magazine. This is another important feature that she was doing at the time. She photographed gay couples in São Paulo, in Rio de Janeiro, trying to really map their activity. There was also, I was researching on the archives of life, and I also saw another feature on homosexuality in, I think, San Francisco or in California that was very strong. And probably they were mirroring those, those features in the Brazilian magazine. And Claudia did, many pictures for these feature. There was very strong and very beautiful pictures, but it's very interesting also how some of this, actually the feature was published on Realidade magazine without any images. It's just a, very strange text-only article with no images whatsoever. So I feel that there was some kind of censorship or prejudice, or, this working behind the stage when she was addressing themes that were more sensitive to society and, of course, to the dictatorship. One of the other important features that she's doing at the time was what they call the Devil's Train, which is a very horrible title for what it is, because it was a train that was used by immigrants from São Paulo, actually immigrants that were living in São Paulo that came from other states and were trying to find their ways in São Paulo, to live in São Paulo, to work in São Paulo, but they couldn't find work and they couldn't find job. And so São Paulo municipality was paying them a train ticket and some food to go back to their countries, to their states, and return. They were considered unwanted people from the municipality, and it was a very controversial program here that actually expelled those people from trying their chance in São Paulo. And also, it also sensibilized Claudia very much, and she decided, to embark on one of these journeys and follow these people and these trains for, I think, almost a week alone, with no reporters, only herself, and photographing people and talking about their dramas and showing their, their harsh realities, but also producing very beautiful and very strong images, which of course start to be very elaborated in terms of their photographic composition. They are less, descriptive of a situation, but they are very open to, suggesting feelings and other ideas. They are not specifically about the context that's happening there, but I think that can be related to many other contexts of social exclusion in Brazil. So there's a whole beautiful sequence of these women that I feel she doesn't feel very well, and she faints in the train, and she's following her very beautifully into her journey. And it's important here, I think, to make a little note that during this time, Claudia is very connected. Actually, she marries the American photographer George Love. And I think the influence of George Love in her work starts to become very perceptive. Love was a very, very interesting character, and very important and very influential character, I think, for Claudia, that came to actually to live with her in Brazil and to work in the magazine with her. And he brought a whole other idea of, photography as a tool for self-expression. That's, I think, very influenced, by a more subjective proposition of photography, let's say mirrored in what Minor White was trying to achieve, really to try to do something that's so deep and so intense that becomes almost mystical in terms of the representation. But I think for Claudia, it was really a chance to start to experiment with different techniques and different photographic ideas on the photojournalistic work. As you see, she was really, working with black and white and doing the let's say, in a way, the traditional photo essays of the time, very inspired by humanist photography, by socially engaged photography. And I feel from a certain point on, she really, adds other layers to her images. And even, I didn't bring here to show you, but, she's really, she goes back to experiment into the art context. She brings acrylic. She starts to do some projections with her images, rephotographing those images, and even, publishing features on the magazine that are reworking the black and white images as these, images of the arrival of the idea of the psychodrama in Brazil, which was a kind of a very important moment for psychoanalysis in the 70s here. But she's really photographing this story with a renovated energy because of the filters that she is using. Or, for instance, those images that she produced for a feature on drug addiction, where they are, Claudia and a reporter, they are following, they are following someone buying drugs and using drugs and describing their experiences and their sensations inside of an apartment. And of course, she does very direct representations of that in black and white images, but then she is not happy with the directness of those images, and she starts to really rephotograph them and experiment with some new ideas to create more of a feeling and more of an interpretation of what she's experiencing together with the person than really, a direct representation of those images. And this is a very important, I think, change in the context of, magazines in Brazil. It is, I think, a contribution that Realidade is doing in terms of a large audience, because it's really introducing a more original and more challenging way of looking at, photojournalistic images and of describing and narrating stories through photography. And unfortunately, this is something that is going to end soon, and it's going to be ever more difficult because of dictatorship, and because especially of the the institutional act that is promulgated in Brazil in 1968, that really established a very dark moment for artists and for journalism and for magazine and for independence of speech. The third thing that I wanted to highlight on this talk, to understand Claudia's complexity as an artist, is her interest for experimentation and her her interest for the cities and her interest for creating works for herself. I think there are many works that she produced that were not connected to journalism, that were not specifically connected to an art exhibition, but that was Claudia really trying to use photography to investigate society, but also to investigate herself. I think this is something that she repeats over and over, how she's always photographing the other, but what she's really discovering is herself. And I think this is a very important dimension of her, and very important to understand how she's so into that she's very free to do some experimentations. So these are also a very interesting series that we are exhibiting at the exhibition at MAPFRE, that Claudia was doing in downtown São Paulo in a commercial street, where she's laying on the ground and photographing the passersby in this very strange angle. They are looking at her, looking at the viewer, looking at photography. There is a whole tension of, destabilizing the look and the certainty of the image when she's doing and producing those images on Rua Direita. It's a whole series of images that she produced, probably during the Christmas sales on São Paulo's commercial downtown. But these are I feel very important images and very connected to her self-investigation of photography and of herself. And I think another move on that story is the whole series that she did, investigating the life of Sonia, which was also a model that was trying her chance in São Paulo, but couldn't find a job at the time. And she photographs her, she meets her through common friends. She decides to photograph her in her apartment. She's naked. And she photographs her with direct, color positive slides. And then she's not happy with the result. And it takes her a while, to find a way for that, for those images. And she decides to re-photograph them with these filters and overlay them in multiple images on the same negative. And really, through this very free experimentation, she starts to build an investigation, not only on the story of Sonia, but also an investigation on the nature of being a woman, of this essence of being a woman, of a woman's soul, of femininity, of, I think, issues that were very dear and very present for Claudia, and through that she really was trying to create a way to represent them through images, really inventing some representation for that. For those ideas. So it's really, Claudia understanding that photography is not about something that has occurred in front of the photographer, but it's of something, it's kind of a doorway for something that photographer can repropose to us to see and to understand in a different way because of the images and because of the aesthetical qualities that she is trying to formulate or trying to give form to. So I feel this is also a very strong moment for her in the early 70s, because she's, inventing vision, inventing photographic representation for, let's say, psychological and existential questions that she has for herself. I'm sorry, the text is in Portuguese here, but kind of try to summarize what she's saying. It's beautiful how she says, I always thought of women as being blue and men of being gray. But it's mainly an investigation on the women's soul, and of course on the nature of photography, and on photography, ability to represent something that is invisible. These are some of other images from that projection, actually, because she presents that as a projection in São Paulo, but then later publishes on a magazine also as a photo essay. But they're really, really, really strong and beautiful. And I think it's, let's say the last thing that I want to address here, and as this, early education of Claudia in photography, or early production of work in photography, was her very strong interest for nature and for Amazonia and for climate, for environmental questions and for preservation of nature. She's during this time also starting to she's working with some indigenous populations in Brazil, but also, starting to travel Amazonia because it's becoming a very important issue during the dictatorship here. And she's traveling all around trying to, photograph in a very original way and trying to create a representation of that vast, very big territory that, of course, the dictatorship used to call as an empty green continent, but it was not empty at all. It was full of, people, indigenous people, but also people living on the rivers and small cities and small villages and other populations. But as you see, she's using here infrared film, also, not creating a direct representation of the nature, but really creating her own investigation of themes that were very interesting for her. So in 1971, Claudia is 40 years old. As I wanted to make clear, she's already developing many ideas in photography. She developed the idea of the socially engaged photo essay and the anthropological immersion, and the way how she could, really invent a new vision through photographic experimentations and different techniques. Her own investigation of her, herself, this very interesting mirrored relation of trying to reach the other, but eventually finding and discovering more about yourself, and also this very ethical or ecological preoccupation that was very present for her. But I think at that time, Claudia also talks a lot about, her main interest being the vulnerability of the human beings. Many of her works are dedicated to looking at that vulnerability, are dedicated to narrating that vulnerability and to reaching out to that vulnerability. She's not interested, in very grandiose themes and topics. She's really looking at people that are at the margins of society, that are discriminated by society, that are in a way endangered or overlooked by society. And of course, there is a strong relation of that with her own past and the idea of, being a survivor of the Holocaust and the fact that she had to, be expelled from her land, and also had her family, part of her family exterminated and assassinated because of the Nazism. In Europe. And I feel this is a profound trauma in Claudia's story. And this is really what, the drama that moves her as an artist and that moves her investigation and that guides her ethical commitment, not only to photography, but to people that she meets. And I think that she found at this moment, she really found in photography a way to talk about those topics, to try to, improve and help us understand better those topics, but also to use photography to establish new kinds of relation that even don't depend on language, but that can be established visually. This is, so in this context, I feel, is that Claudia travels for the first time to the Yanomami land in 1971 to do a special issue of Realidade magazine that was dedicated to understanding the problems of the Amazonia, because there was, at the time, a very important public investment on Amazonia. The dictatorship in Brazil decided to launch the national integration program in 1971 with a lot of money and a lot of interest in exploiting the resources of the Amazonia, because it was seen at the time as our lucky pot, let's say, as the way that Brazil was going to enrich itself as a nation and become part of the so-called first world. So there is a very ambitious, very violent, and very strong investment program on the Amazonia that's mobilizing all the country's attention and the press and everything. And Claudia's, and to address that, the magazine does a special issue on that subject, and Claudia travels with as one of the staff reporters to report on that. And she goes to one of very small region of the Yanomami region and photographs this Yanomami and publish these first pictures on the magazine. She was not supposed. She had, expressed orientation from the magazine not to photograph indigenous people, but I think because they knew the indigenous people were a problem for the dictatorship, but I think because of, the sweetness and let's say, the empathic images that she created, they were able to really publish, and actually give her the cover of the magazine. Although, very surprisingly, the story that they narrate on the text is a very, very strong story of, the genocide of indigenous population, not only during the dictatorship, before the dictatorship, but since the colonization and the arrival of the Portuguese in Brazil. So actually, for me, it's very surprising to see how such a very critical piece of writing was published during this time in Brazil. And I think there is some relation to kind of a disguise in the article with this more romanticized images. So I think here it's, the thing I want to show you here is also how an artist with that, understanding of photography, society, also arrives at a place with not full knowledge of that place, and starts a long trajectory of reinventing herself, her art, her images, her being in the world. The more she gets familiar with that reality, and the more she understands the complexity of that reality, and the more she gets involved with that reality. And you will see, Claudia's first images were very, let's say, more romantic, you can look at them in a more naive way. But I feel the more she travels to the Anomaly land, the more complex and the deeper she tries to represent that society. Claudia gets two Guggenheim grants to do her work. She quits photojournalism, she quits her life in Realidade magazine, and really decides, I want to dedicate myself to a long-term project. I'm not interested on the fast pace of journalism. I'm kind of exhausted of, the time I have to focus on one story. I really want, to dive into something and just move on into one single story or one single idea. And she decides to do that with a Guggenheim grant, and to dedicate that research to the Anomaly. And so she starts to produce very, interesting pictures. She arrives at the Anomaly land, and with the help of a missionary that was living there, that spoke the language, that was already, working to reinforce the protection of the Anomaly and the rights for their cultures. She's welcomed, and she starts to partner in the communities and in their daily lives. And she starts, after some time, to photograph. This is something that takes her a little while to be comfortable to really photograph and to understand what she's doing there. It's very difficult for her to be on the forest, to walk, for many days in the forest, to live in a way that was not the way that she was used to live at that time. It's very difficult to photograph. You see, it's very humid, it's very dark. She has all different problems, but I think she's really enthusiastic about learning about, this entire people that are living in the Amazonia that she didn't know of before. And she starts to photograph, I think first, the routine on the forest, let's say the external life of the Yanomami, the way that they went for hunting, for, even for playing. You see here the hunting camps of one of the big hunting expeditions, where the families would camp on the very far away from their villages on the forest to gather hunt for the feasts. That's Claudia with very young Yanomam boy. These are the women that are hunting and then cooking this big bird. I think so. Part also of our research on this project was to really understand, the changes in Claudia's photography, and also understanding the changes on her image making, but also you have the opportunity to bring back to those images the information that we now have accessible that she didn't have at the time, because of our closer proximity to the Yanomami, and especially because of a very important Yanomami contribution to our understanding of their society and their cosmovision, which is Davi Kopenawa's book, The Falling of the Sky. So it was for the research that we encompassed during the production of the exhibition, it was a long process that involved many people to really try to find, to identify those people, to understand exactly what those images were about, to bring back their, contextual information, so that we could look at them as if we were seeing, street photography, so that we could really recognize them in another way, and even have other kinds of empathy to what we were seeing, instead of, risking the idea of looking at them in a romanticized, idealized way. And I think this was a very important part of the research and of the collaborative contribution that I think we managed to bring to Claudia's work through the association with the Yanomami, the Hutucara Yanomami, with Davi Kopenawa, which is a very important Yanomami leader, but also with other NGOs and anthropologists and many people that were working around this region that were not originally connected to art and photography, because we really wanted to expand the meaning of those images. And I felt, so when we reorganized Claudia's archive chronologically to really understand, shifts and different moments, it was interesting to see, also how she was, with time incorporating techniques and different techniques to represent different things. So you see on the first images, black and white images, she's blurring the lines with the Vaseline on the camera and creating these very impressive distortions on the sky. I'm sorry to go back here, but just to exemplify something that I feel it's important. There is, there is a very strong reading of the sky in the Yanomami mythology, and they're in their cosmovision. It's not, by chance that Davi's book is called The Falling of the Sky. And I feel that Claudia was really trying to use those experimentations and these photographic techniques to try to represent something that was invisible, that she was learning, but that we could not see otherwise. And I think this is really, really original and very important in the context of the 70s, because of course, you may imagine in Brazil, we were, experiencing and looking at more anthropological, ethnographic photography, in images produced from non-Indigenous people that were very, that fit a very strong pattern of representation. And I think Claudia was really, trying to break free from that and really trying to incorporate the understanding of the indigenous Yanomami into their images, even if, of course, they represented her own vision, her personal, her completely subjective interpretation of that. She was also using, as you see here, infrared film, which is, I think it's something very important because it was also a technology that was being used by the military in Brazil to map the Amazonia ground in search for minerals and for, ways to expand the exploitation. So in a way, she's subversively appropriating a technique that was not intended for artistic representation, but that was developed and used by the military in Brazil for something that was, opposite to what she was trying to, convey with her images. But she's, using them, photographing the same land and giving to it another kind of dimension. And I feel another suggestion. So I've tried in a very, risky manner to, to associate things that we are learning with Davi Kopenawa's words about, the interpretation of the land, the sky, the circulation of the spirits. But also I feel, when we think of, climate change, climate heating, all the ideas of environmental degradation or protection, an experience that we are now discussing, and we look at those images, I think we can really understand that Claudia was, trying to reach to something that was much more complex than specifically just documenting Amazonia or the Roraima State area where the Anomaly were living, where she was inhabiting. So with the Guggenheim grant, she was able to travel many times to the region, to stay for extended periods there, and to really produce a very strong body of work that really, creates a certain that offers us a chance to view something that's completely new. And I think with time, also Claudia, where she was participating in the daily activities, she was blending her photography with other kinds of help and collaborations. But I felt that she was also getting access to more intimate situations, photographing inside of the collective house of the Yanomami, which is a more intimate space where the families gather, where they discuss things and live things, and she's really photographing these places. You see here a very kind of a cinematic sequence where she's photographing this young man, and then probably what he's looking, and then his face again, daydreaming, which she rephotographs with a filter, and it's a very beautiful sequence of images. But what I think is important here is really that she's trying to convey something that's different and that's much larger than the reality that she's accessing. I think she's really trying to create iconic representations of something that really transcends reality and that really go beyond the direct representation of photography as a kind of a document, despite the fact that it is always a document. And we also try to reinforce that idea on the research that we have done on her work. And you see here, for instance, a very common, banal scene inside of the Maloca, but this amazing, beautiful image of this young Yanomami boy looking at Claudia, and that she is transformed in a way by the light that's shining all over in a kind of a mythical and very spiritualized entity that I think has a very strong relation to the way the Yanomami really see the world, the land, and how they see the circulation of these miniature spirits that inform the shamans and that guide the society in social ways. One of the important series of this period is the Reahu series, which is she's documenting the funeral rituals and the intercommunitary rituals of the Yanomami, where they really, not only celebrate or homage the death of a deceased person, but also make sure this person ascend to the what they call the back of the sky, is the other dimension of the sky, not the breast of the sky, which is what we can see. But interestingly enough, Claudia, I think she's, she prepares herself a lot to be able to access, to photograph those ceremonies, and also to create more complex representation of those ceremonies, which are very, divided in different rituals and very specialized in terms of their meanings and their relevance for the Yanomami life. So she's photographing, for instance, the women's chant is a very important moment where they chant and they ask for instance, for the soul of the fertility to be spread upon the earth. But she's using, this very slow shutter that creates this kind of spiritual bond among women and the sense of movement. She's using, for instance, slow shutter speed to create these rays of light that are very interesting connections to the music, the sounds, the voices, but also to the mirrors where they describe that the Shapiro spirit circulates, or she's photographing the ceremony of the Yakoana inhaling, which is a very important moment where all the men there present have to inhale Yakoana to really feed the Shapiro spirits and be in connection with them. So they say they die and they can ascend and really be in touch with the Shapiris, which are the, let's say, the image incarnations of the essential beings of the earth, and are the spirits that really help them guide, give ecological response, or cure people, or organize societies and conflicts, and administer the social life of the Anomaly. And it's very beautiful because I think this is, Claudia is in the height of a very experimental and personal interpretation of images, very free to use, different techniques. But I think she's also, when you read her letters to the Guggenheim Grant, she's also a bit skeptical of her capability of really, representing such a complex vision of the world through photography. And so she starts to try other ways to do that. And I think one way is establishing a drawing project. So she gets another grant, brings kilos of paper and pen to the Anomaly region, and starts to help people and ask people to collaborate in a drawing project, and draw, narrate their stories, narrate their lives. And they create a very, very important body of work to understand the Anomaly cosmovision, but also to offer a different representation of that vision, a visual representation of that cosmovision. That is very interesting, very complex, and that gives another dimension to what we understand as an artistical production that tries to interpret a culture and a society. And I feel this is also a very important moment in Claudia being also in doubt of the centrality of an artist and the centrality of her own personality in offering the Yanomami ways to speak out and to talk about their stories and to bring this outside of the Yanomami territory. This is a very important moment in the story because this all this exploration, investigation, and learning process is interrupted by the dictatorship's plan to build roads right in the middle of the Yanomami land. They create a massive program of migration and bring thousands of workers to the region, and construction companies start to build roads right in the middle of the Yanomami land, where they were living in a quite isolated way, of course, with no planning, in a very violent way, and really trying to undercover and to hide, the clash of that contact. Claudia and people who were working there, were living there. They sensed that immediately. They tried to denounce that, and for trying to act against that, actually Claudia is taken away from the Yanomami land. She's expelled by the government and obliged to move. She had she was living there. She really just bought a one-way ticket and decided to live there, but then she's very violently taken away from there. And she has to spend 1 year in Sao Paulo trying to get authorization to go back. And this is a very, I think, crucial year, 1975, for her, because I think she decides, to put a stop in all this artistic representation and interpretation of what she's doing. She produces 3 books that are very important, that really summarizes the research that she was doing at the time. I feel in a way it's a kind of a, ending of that idea, but also because of the urgency of what's going on. She knows, and she, I think, understands, because she starts to get involved with a wider indigenous context of people that are really worried about the behavior of the dictatorship towards the indigenous rights and protection. And she starts to get involved when she's in Sao Paulo with small NGOs, organizations, indigenous leaders, and many other people that are fighting for the protection of the indigenous people all over Brazil under the dictatorship. And she really understands that, the artistic interpretation, those images, her art couldn't do and couldn't save these people from that violence, which is at this point dramatic, because it's really, the epidemics, the introduction of alcohol, violence, guns, all this is just, it spreads like fire into the Yanomami land and is killing, dozens of people. The population of the Yanomami starts to descend very rapidly. And of course, there is no interest from the government to address that, or even to, to show that. And so I feel this is a big shift on Claudia understanding of her role, not as an artist, but as a person, and her ethical commitment to that cause. And she really moves and decides to create NGO to defend the demarcation and protection of the Yanomami. And from that period on, I think she's really focused and dedicated on that cause and on that idea. And she really changes, the way photography, the way she thinks of images, of photography, of art, and expands this to really build, or join actually a network of people that were already working with the defense of the indigenous populations in Brazil. And so I feel there is, a major shift on the understanding of her images from this point on, because she really starts, to work night and day with these people within this network, organizing protests, organizing campaigns, organizing programs, writing letters, mobilizing public, bringing awareness to try to stop the killing, the extermination of the Yanomami. And she is producing images, very few images at that time, and those images are mostly used to instrumentalize those political actions. They are, she's really moving away from the artistic milieu and really trying to help as much as she can into the very direct activist and political scenario. And I feel she produces very strong images, for instance, of the road construction with the Yanomami that were living isolated and migrated to the side of the road to exchange for food and guns and industrial goods that were using now guns, or images of the Yanomamis that were close to the mining fields, the illegal mining grounds that were connected to pornography. They were smoking cigarettes, that were subject of alcoholism, children that were having malnutrition. In the 70s and 80s, there is really a clash, and I think that is enhanced at the end of the 70s, at the end of the 80s, with the incentive for mining and into the Yanomami land. So there is another flock of illegal mining that is polluting the land, that is destroying the environment, but also that is creating a very violent underworld of prostitution, alcoholism, and bringing especially epidemics of measles and other very infectious diseases that are completely destroying the Yanomami because they didn't have any kind of protection for that. And the important point that I want to make here is really how her images, I'm sorry, become now, another level of instrument for this political fight. And they are used in a context very different from the artistic context, which is as instruments for NGOs and anthropological association, indigenous organizations to really reinforce the awareness of people and denounce what's going on the land. And this is a major organization of people that starts to work. So it's Davi Kopenawa, the Yanomami leader, becomes very close to Claudia, and they start to travel all over the place to talk about what's going on in their land. The NGOs, Ailton Krenak is another important leader that is working at this time. Bruce Albert, anthropologist. Carlos Aquini, the missionary. There is, this Severo Gomes, the senator. Many people that are now creating this very important network to try to stop the violence and the extermination of indigenous people all over Brazil. And one other interesting aspect of her photography at the time was the way that she used it for to speed up and to work on the health programs. In around the mid-80s, Claudia and two other doctors, and through the NGO that they created, they start to raise money to create a very urgent emergential vaccination program. And they get this money and they start to travel the Yanomami land, which is very wide, to vaccinate people. And the way they found to do this is create these medical records to keep track of the medical conditions of people and document these 3x4 images of people, of all the Yanomami that they find with this number on their necks, because there is a whole problem of how to identify them through their names. And this is something that they do very urgently to map society, to give the vaccines, and to try to save as much as they can people before they are dying, because the scenario is really dramatic. And much later, she also relooks at those images. You might know the series Marcados that Claudia has produced. And she brings her, the series back to the artistic context to really try to talk about, the violence of, marking people in the case of the Anomaly to save them. But she creates a very ambiguous parallel with their own past of marking people to kill them during the Holocaust. And I feel it's, Claudia at this time is also writing this very important report on the Anomaly situation of contact and health. And I think this is also a very interesting thing, because it's a major, there's, I think, more than 200 pages report of the situation of the Anomaly all over the extension of their place, to talk about the context. And this is the base of the demarcation of the land that is now, the major goal of this association. It's what they are fighting for. So just for you to have an idea, so Claudia is during the 70s producing in the Catrimani, but then she discovers, the much bigger land of the Yanomami, the different groups, the different languages, the different scale, and they are fighting for a continuous demarcation of that land. Davi is now speaking on Brazilian Congress. Claudia is in England with Davi for the first time, an international trip, to talk about the deforestation and the gold rush in the context of the Guardian newspaper. They are really, working a lot to do this. And I think just, to offer kind of a third moment, I feel, for the understanding of the power of images on that political fight and struggle, and also the power of art, is when Claudia in 1989 decides to revisit her entire archive, because they are about to ask for the demarcation in a continuous territory. But actually the recently appointed democratic government in Brazil, the dictatorship ended in 1985, decides to demarcate the land in 19 isolated islands, which is of course a way to just asphyxiate the Anomaly, because they cannot, circulate, the hunt, the game cannot renovate the forest resources, and etc. And Claudia is at the time, she's not photographing anymore. She's completely dedicated to this fight and this group of people. But she decides to re-photograph her archive done in the 70s and in the very early 80s, and create a major projection in São Paulo to protest in a exhibition coordinated by the CCPY NGO, to protest against that demarcation and to raise public awareness of the killing of the Yanomami through that demarcation and to the exploitation of their land. And she really re-photographs everything in a very beautiful goldish tone, very strong, and projects that in these strips of isolated pieces of images, which I of course read it as a kind of a metaphor to the isolated lands that they were trying to fight against, and creates a very beautiful narrative, or a very moving narrative of a people that was living in perfectly harmony to the nature, but that then is being destroyed by our greed, our idea of development and our society, and creates a very moving piece called The Genocide of the Anomaly. And I think after a lot of effort from this generation and this mobilization of people, they finally get the demarcation of the land in 1992, and things start to change in a way for the Anomaly, because they have their land demarcated. And I think this is a very important moment, but also a very important understanding of how an artist's trajectory can change in many different ways. Images can change in many different ways to really help reinforce ethical commitments, for us to question really what is the political understatement of art, or how art is can really work politically. I think from this period on, Claudia understand that her archive is really a very important tool to help the visibility of the Yanomami, to help reinforce the rights of the Yanomami. And Claudia and Davi Kopenawa, they really partner in the next years to really use those images as a very, very strong tool to fight for the Yanomami respect and autonomy, independence, and way of living. And of course, all this interpretation is also challenged now by the new government in Brazil that has been, transforming or bringing back this nightmare and this ignorance from the dictatorship, and really challenging the demarcation and many of the other accomplishments that the Yanomami themselves, but also other indigenous people have managed to do in terms of respecting the constitution that was promulgated in 1985, and respecting their lands and respecting their independence and choosing the way they want to live and be recognized and really keep on administering their own society and culture. And this has really become a very crucial issue because all this pressure, all this awareness, and all this, the fight of this generation has been revived by the menaces of our new president and the Brazilian government neglect towards the Yanomami, because the demarcation is effortless if it's not reinforced by the police. So the COVID, the pandemics, and many other issues have brought back many of the things that those people thought they had accomplished, and that they could go a step beyond and fight for other things. So, but it also brought a renovated, I think, importance to the work of Claudia, and to that understanding of image as a weapon to the defense of a people and to the protection of those people. And I think I feel that there is a very interesting new dimension to that story, which is the recent adoption by the Yanomami of their own image production. And this is something that we are all very keen and very happy with, because it's, I think, for the new generation is a new opportunity to really take these images and produce their own narratives and understand the power of the images in terms of creating a narrative and a discourse and a political opposition to that to the violence and to the oppression that our society has been casting all over the world. And so I feel that there is a new stage now where really Claudia is I think the Anomaly really taught Claudia to use images as an arrow to fight against what they want to fight. And Claudia, let's say, became an arc for that, because she was really instrumental for that fight. But I think now there is a new and very exciting generation of Yanomami that are producing their own narratives and understanding that they will need those images, and they will need, not only Claudia's archive, but also their own stories to fight against oppression. And so Mozarniel Yanomami is one of those person. He's a young Yanomami that is documenting the Reahu festivals and interviewing the Yanomami leaders. He's now preparing another movie. He did this movie that was the Healers of the Forest Land, but he's now preparing a new movie. There are, different initiatives from the Yanomami people to vocalize their own quests and their own demands. I think Hutucar Association has been very instrumental in promoting that. So they are, using images to ask for money, to ask for the radio program, to ask for things that are very important to the Yanomami. And of course, Davi Kopenawa is a very important leader on that, because he is really, promoting and bringing also new generations to work as leaders and create campaigns that are now all over the world to really try to stop that. So I just, yeah, maybe I'll just conclude here, but I just wanted to, you know, to end with this. I had to, of course, be very synthetic in this time. It's such a complex story for photography, for Claudia, for the Anomaly, for our work on that project. But these are some of the, you know, extra information if people want to dive into the subject a little bit further. But I just really hope that the point here is clear, which is really, you know, how to look at art in a different way, and how to look maybe beyond art, how to look, you know, of course, at art's role in terms of the political struggle, but also in our ethical commitments that should define this role and should, you know, command our determination in terms of protecting the other and of looking at those images, which we cannot look at innocently or in a naive terms, but we have really to look at in a very deep way and be sure that we are using images not only to address and to narrate political or dramas, but really to instrumentalize those dramas and to make sure that there is a difference because of those images and the presence of those images, whether they are, you know, individual images that were taken in a single frame, whether they are whole stories that are, you know, composed by someone, or whether they are archives of images that are that can really, you know, be reincarnated over and over, as long as they have, you know, this commitment to really defend and to really protect and to bring awareness to the things that are essential and that are urgent in our society. And I hope this is something that, you know, Claudia, I think Claudia has learned a lot about that throughout her career. She has, you know, tried to teach us some of that, I think. I have studied her life, you know, really trying to map these understandings and trying to, you know, pass in maybe a didactic way or maybe a too didactic way for the audiences. But I think there is, you know, a whole story that's connected to that, which is the story of the Anomaly, the story of images, and the whole narrative of the tensions between representation and visual representation and political representation that I think we are addressing, and we need to keep, you know, addressing and evolving and experimenting and exploring and reinforcing. So I'm not sure, probably my phone went down, so I'm not sure if I'm on time, but I hope I am.
Thyago, I want to thank you deeply for your contribution with this lecture, because it has been very, very interesting and has given us a very complete perspective of both the life and the work of Claudia. Cuando hablas de Claudia,
when you talk about Claudia,
de que Claudia y tú mismo habéis
and you say
intentado
that Claudia and yourself have tried to go to the limits of this work. We're losing the sound, I'm afraid. I'm losing the sound from Maria.
I'm sorry, Maria, because I'm hearing you and the translator one at the top of the other, so maybe there's something I need to adjust here on the. Your sound is cut for me. I don't hear you very well. And let me know if I have to. Yeah, it's better.
Can you listen to me now?
Can you hear now, Thyago? Can you hear me?
Yeah, but I listen to. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I listen to you and the translator so I don't understand either English, either Spanish or English. So should I change anything here on my settings?
No, él teóricamente no debe tocar nada.
No, in theory, you should not have to do anything. There's an option that says silence or mute original audio. Silence or mute original audio. Is that okay now?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't hear you, Maria, and your beautiful Spanish, but...
No te oigo, María, a ti, desgraciadamente, y tu hermoso español, pero voy a seguir la interpretación. I was saying that you say that Claudia and yourself, you've been trying to widen the limits of this conversation. I think it's obvious that you achieve your purpose, because every time you talk about this exhibition, you talk about many things that go beyond photography, beyond art, anthropology, environment, ecology, respect, political struggle. And there is always that issue of alliances between people. And when we think about Avi Kopenauer, the leader that you've mentioned, he goes beyond this and understands how photography can help in political struggle. So it's key, I think, your alliance with Claudia. And the Yanomami have also changed the way that they consider photography after meeting Claudia. So I think in spite of all the adversity, political struggle, there is hope regarding the power of people to organize and use photography to struggle. And there's a question, we haven't got practically any time left, but there's a question from Michelle Suarez, which asks whether you could give us an idea of what the legacy of Claudia Andujar is in current Brazilian photography. What is the legacy of Claudia?
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Michele. I think you talked about some things that are very important here, which is first the idea of an alliance, which I think goes much beyond, as I have tried to say, much beyond art. Or I mean, we don't even know if art has dissolved into activism in terms of Claudia, and maybe this is another way that art can operate and really being engaged directly in political activism. But I feel really, this trajectory of learning and reestablishing these alliances and understanding which are the important alliances and which are, the drawbacks and which are the faults and which are the difficulties, and really trying to reinvent those alliances over and over and over. And for me, this is the most, I think, beautiful contribution of Claudia. Is not really to offer something that is fixed. It's not to offer any kind of certainty, of assurance, of in terms of herself, that where we can really hang our our own certainties, and we can really hang on. I feel that she's really defying the places where she is arriving as an artist, but mostly as a human person, a human being, and that path is really guided by her ethical understanding of the questions that she's facing and her ethical commitment to those questions. And I think for me, this is if there is something that she can really teach the artists, is really how to understand and how to investigate those ethical commitments and also these ethical questions. You also mentioned something that I think is really important, which is the Yanomami re-understanding of those images. As you know, the Yanomami and many other indigenous people were against photography. They have many reasons for being against. But after so much struggle and after so much, after all of them, what they've been through, they now incorporated Claudia's images as their own bows and arrows, as David says, as their weapons against the same society that is threatening them. So they understood that those images were really important for their defense, for their knowledge as a weapon, and they because of that ethical commitment, they decided that those images could circulate. And I think part of the research that I've tried to do with Claudia was to bring back very strongly that story behind the images, so that we don't risk looking at them in a staticized, romanticized, art only context exclusively. Again, I felt that, this, with years in Brazil, in the 2000s, I feel with the urgency of the fight, things were being of course, because of the demarcation and in a way the settling of some of the rights of the Yanomami, we thought, all this political story was being left behind. All this very important story and complex story was being forgotten by younger generations. And we thought it was really important to retrace that and to really show that there is no art and there is no images of Claudia, and her whole life is, a response and an interaction to that situation. And that needed to be comprehended as a whole, because I really feel this is, the biggest contribution that she can offer as an artist to all of us, to our museums, to our institutions. It's really to show the power of images and the ethical commitments that underlie those images. I also feel there is, as I said, a new generation working on that. I think Michelle's question was, if I can, it's as I'm trying to, it's really hard to summarize, that such, Claudia has been working, since the 70s, when she really decided that she was going to dedicate herself to, to living, to studying, to collaborating with the Anomaly. She's been doing so, and she's 90 years old next month. And this is 5 decades of learning, understanding, etc. What I was trying to say is really, I feel she's a very, how to say that in English, but she's a very lonely, she has a very lonely and very determined and very unique trajectory in the art context in Brazil, I think, and in the art, in photography especially. I feel there are very people in the world that have really understood, their role in society, and their role as an image maker, and their political roles in association with other indigenous groups, as Claudia did. There are many artists that have worked with indigenous, but I really feel that Claudia was able to, to re-understand that and to move on and to really expand every question that she had in a very different way, because of her deep involvement, because of her, strong connection, and because of her tireless dedication to this cause. And so I see her kind of as a very, isolated guideline for us, but not only for Brazilian society. I mean, in photography, as much as I can, understand from the history of photography worldwide, there are very few artists and photographers that have managed, to go deeper and the complex as Claudia did, with such an integrity, to the point that she, still today, 90 years old, with a lot of, difficulties and shortcomings, working night and day for the protection of the Yanomami, for the correct use of the rights of her photographs, and I think much more than that, for the the respect, the social respect for the Yanomami independence, and for all the indigenous and all the minorities and all people there, as I said, are vulnerable and need to be respected by our ignorance, by the violence of our ignorance and oppression. And I think this is, something that she can give to us, and she can share with us. It's really our responsibilities on that fight, and what, someone can do to help, even if a sole person, can really be, collaborate in things in a way that is very important and very necessary. And of course, I think she's helped a lot with her work to open space, and that was part of this project, to open space for the Anomaly to talk, to speak out, to tell the stories, and to, be part of our society.
Thyago, it was really hard to sum up all the questions that you and Claudia have brought to the exhibition, but I think you have done really good job today with the lecture. So thank you again for your contribution, and have a nice evening. Muchas gracias a todos por habernos acompañado.
Thank you to everyone for being with me. For being with us. Thank you very much to the audience. Thank you. And we'll see you on the 11th with the next exhibition, the next session
y segunda sesión de
the
invitados.
second session of this series. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a todos. Muchísimas gracias. Muchas gracias a Mapfre y a todos que
Thank
trabajaron
you to everyone, to
en el
Mafre,
proyecto.
and to everybody who's been involved in this project. Thank you very much.
Increíble de personas. Thank you very
An
much.
incredible amount of people.
Gracias, Thiago.